Hello and welcome to this video. Today we're joined by Laurance to talk about the Akedah, a part of Genesis where Abraham is called to sacrifice his son by God. A lot of people have been questioned, tormented by this command. They're like, why would God do this? Why would God have these ideas? Why would God ask someone to carry out what is seemingly such a immoral act? So without further ado, let's get right into it. Laurance, what do you think about the Akedah?
Well, first, let's say what happens. God tested Abraham. He said to him, Abraham, and he said, Here I am. He said, Take your only son, your son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I shall show you. And so on, Abraham follows the command, and at the moment upon which he was about to sacrifice Isaac, the angel of the Lord came down to him and said, Abraham, Abraham. And Abraham replied, Here I am. He said, Do not lay your hand upon the boy or do anything to him, for I know now that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And Abraham looked up and saw a ram caught in the thicket by its horns. Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, the Lord will provide. So that is the Akedah, Genesis 22, the sacrifice of Isaac. And today I will defend the position that it is not ethically justified, but can only be justified in the religious sphere, as Kierkegaard argues.
Yes, and I will propose, and I'm not sure that I would say I defend perhaps, but I will propose a separate reading, which I think leads ultimately to quite a similar argument that Kierkegaard provides. But I would propose that potentially it was not actually God which commanded Abraham to sacrifice his son, but rather a devil or another illusion. Yet, regardless of whether it was a devil or not, the faith of Abraham and his actions justify his acts, and it becomes and accounted to him as righteous, I suppose. So, perhaps we could start off by just talking or laying out a variety of the views on the Akedah. What are some of the main positions, would you say, of scholars or at least thinkers who have wrestled with this question throughout history?
Okay, so I'll go through a sort of quick, shotgun ride through some of the history of this. So traditionally, people thought that this was an example of Abraham's faith, and that we should almost follow him in this regard. By the time of the Enlightenment, you come to Kant, who argues that in fact, what Josh will be arguing, that actually this is a cruel and evil God, and that no good God would ever violate the categorical imperative in this way, that is to breach the relation between father and son. From then on, you move on to people like Kierkegaard, who try and respond to this in an existentialist manner, the position I'll be defending. And afterwards, there were interesting, more anthropological explanations, something like Levinson's discussion about how actually child sacrifice was quite normalized within sort of ancient Near East societies. Or even from there, there's a even very interesting perspective, which I don't know if we'll have enough time to discuss, but Eliezer Berkowitz's With God in Hell, his analysis of how sort of Orthodox Jewish perspectives post with reflections after the Holocaust, and how they sort of try to use this story as a way to represent the sort of trust that they have in the covenant. But we'll see if we have enough time to go onto that. But the position I'll be defending is Kierkegaard's one, and Josh, you'll be defending
a somewhat Kantian one, I suppose. Though I suppose the best place to start off with is perhaps not talk about the ones that either of us are defending, and perhaps start off with, I suppose, the biggest or at least the most common objection, or at least the most common reading. I think this is quite similar to Paul Copan's view in his God, a Moral Monster, where he talks about the anachronistic kind of objection, or at least problem, that we have when we are looking back at the time of the story, where we notice that a lot of times when we are looking at the situation, the sacrifice of the child was not only perhaps the sacrifice of the child per se, but also almost symbolic giving back to God that which was the best. And in this situation, Isaac, the child, represents not necessarily a child in a moral status, but rather the giving back to God what was rightfully his, which was the gift of the child. And you almost have that Jobian reply where he says, the Lord gives and the Lord takes away, blessed be God, almost in that sense. If we're just looking at it from our landscape, saying a child has to be sacrificed, or a child has to be gotten rid of, or a child has to be killed, perhaps that is not the correct way to look at it. Perhaps we are just being anachronistic and we're judging it by our modern times. What is your thoughts about that objection, or what are your thoughts about that interpretation?
Yeah, that sort of follows the Levinson idea as well, that child sacrifice was in fact quite normal in a lot of those societies. Now, my objection to that is, I think if we view it in terms of the story itself, if we abandon our common ethical presuppositions about child murder and child sacrifice, we can see that there's a very great danger in what God demands here. God demands that his own covenant could possibly be broken. Now, the common objection to that is, well, what about Ishmael? I mean, isn't Ishmael also Abraham's son? However, I would counter that by saying, number one, Ishmael is no longer with the household. This is after his expulsion from the household, and secondly, um, there are hints throughout the two major covenant passages, especially in 17, where it seems to be that Isaac is the one who is favored over Ishmael, perhaps suggesting the common sort of trope of the younger being favored over the older. But regardless, it seems to me that even within the sort of scope of the text and the scope of the society in the text, even if you think that the sort of act itself is not bad and can be justified almost culturally, which I don't know if I'd be willing even to go there, but even if you are willing to give that, you surely should be able to understand that this is a breach to the covenant that God had promised to Abraham. And this is the problem of the text. There seems to be an absurdity here. God tells Abraham he will give him a son, he will give him an heir, he won't have to give his lands and stuff to Eliezer of Damascus. He has been forced to move to this place called Canaan, and he's promised all of these things. And now the promise seems to be under threat. And if you want to view the sort of problem in those terms, that's fine. I will also be talking in terms of just general child sacrifice and ethical roles between father and son too.
I think you raise a very interesting point, because I guess if you're thinking about it from the perspective of Abraham, he clearly looks at the promise of God and is like, well, you've promised the descendants to come through this figure. And as a result, when he is called to sacrifice the child, he almost is called to say, well, time to give up that sacrifice as well. And of course, there is that question at the back of the minds, and I've seen this in the numerous commentaries, where when he is going to the cross, or well, not the cross, but I suppose some people symbolically read the cross into it, but when Abraham is going to sacrifice the child, in many senses, the way he is going there, some people might say, is that he was already expecting something miraculous to happen. He was expecting a divine intervention. And I'm not too sure whether I agree with that reading, just because it seems to me that the sacrifice and the significance of the sacrifice only makes sense and only means something if Abraham went through the entire process of the sacrifice, not expecting there to be a divine intervention. Because I suppose if he was expecting a deus ex machina, for example, what might happen is that, well, all right, the true faith, the true test of faith might not have been that powerful. And I think it goes on even to the point where in the text, God waits, or the angel of God waits till Abraham raises the knife over the head of his child. It almost is that sacrifice to Abraham psychologically. When he raises the knife, Isaac is already dead at that position to him, that he is willing to draw the knife down. It's only then which the knife is stopped, not before, not after, but precisely when he raises it up. That is the moment where Isaac psychologically dies for Abraham, and I think that is the extent of that vision. And also on the side point as well, I would say that this anachronistic, or this criticism of the text, would seem to me to not give enough credit to God, to not give enough credit to the actual gravity of that command, and to view it with our conceptions in mind is vital in order to understand the true depth and significance and existential angst that command might lead to. Is there anything you want to say?
Yeah, I think actually I would complicate things a little bit further in your reading. I do think there is at least a little bit of hope that he does think something else will happen. So I think it is when Isaac asks, who will provide the sacrifice for the lamb? Abraham responds, God will provide the sacrifice. Now, in that case, is Abraham sort of hiding the truth, concealing the truth from Isaac? Is he sort of silently telling him it's going to be you because there's nothing else to be sacrificed? Or is he just unsure? And I think the best answer out of those three for me would be unsure. I think there's a part of him in which he knows the sort of fear and trembling that is occurring with that he's about to sacrifice his own son, his own promise, and at his own laughter, as to follow the sort of etymological punish sort of nature of Isaac's name. Or is something else going to happen? He still has he has that niggling feeling that there's something out there that's going to happen, some surprise. I think that God will provide this, and it's interesting that this is why at the end it sort of becomes an etiological thing. Now the whole thing just becomes why this place is called this certain name, the place that God provided. So I think it's not necessarily that he's just feeling this sort of, oh no, I'm going to kill my son and God's not going to do anything about it, or oh, God's going to definitely do something about it. I'm not going to, my son's not going to get killed. I think it's a very heated mixture of emotions that's happening within Abraham's mind that comes out in the words, God will provide the sacrifice.
Yes, I quite like I like that interpretation, and to me, I suppose a modern day equivalent to that would be almost when you've known you've done really badly in a test, and the paper's coming out, and you're thinking, okay, I must have failed, but there's always that niggling hope in the back of the mind that yes, I know I probably have failed, but maybe there's that 1% that things might change, and perhaps that could be a potential approach to it. Do you think that's a good way of looking at it, or do you think it's a bit different?
No, I think it's something like that, and the use of the term test as well, like exactly. This is how the sort of our whole thing begins. God decided to test Abraham. In a way, he is put to the test, and he doesn't know whether he will succeed or not. Or he doesn't really know what it takes. He knows what it takes to succeed. He must sacrifice his son, but he doesn't know exactly what's going to entail. And I think it's this sort of disparity between knowledge and lack of knowledge when it comes to what God is commanding here, the sort of absurdity and the paradox that God seems to be commanding here, is fully sort of manifest uh, in this very sort of stout answer. God will provide the sacrifice. The emotions, right, are not really present in the text. It seems to be that it's very methodological, and he collects the materials he needs, he gets his slaves and brings them to the mountain, he leaves them at the bottom of the mountain, they walk up. However, I think within that little piece of dialogue, I think there's a lot of sort of uh, packed emotions between the lines. I think that you can sort of read there.
And I suppose that raises potentially questions about how to read the Bible, which we perhaps wouldn't get into today. But perhaps moving on from that point, we could touch on a bit more about the anachronistic readings of it. How much of a criticism do you think that actually is at the end of the day? Do you think we should be saying, okay, it's all right, child sacrifice isn't that bad given the context of the time, or do you think that is ultimately quite a dangerous approach to have?
I think it's a bit of a dangerous approach to have. Like, I do appreciate the role of understanding things contextually. However, uh, as I understand it, it becomes really difficult to try and assess these sorts of texts which do have um, conclusions for our modern day and our modern understanding of ethics for a lot of people, if we are to begin to merely try and contextualize them as much as possible. Because there's two sorts of problems with this. Number one, there's a problem with trying to find out what actually is going on there. I mean, there were a lot of ancient Near East societies which did have a significant amount of child sacrifice, even up until like the Roman period, where the Republican period, where it is accounted that Carthaginians, descendants of the Phoenicians, who also come from the Levant, also committed child sacrifices quite earnestly as well. So it seems to me that this thing is still quite a historical fact. Now the question is, at the time when Abraham was writing, at the time when this was being written by whoever wrote it and whoever then edited it and whoever possibly rewrote it, edited it, and rewrote it again, like, how much of this sort of notion of child sacrifice was maintained? Was it maintained to the whole of this period? Was it maintained to part of this period? Was it maintained so far that one person says, oh yeah, it was okay to commit child sacrifice at this time, it was not okay to commit child sacrifice at another time? This is why we have the other story. It seems to me a bit difficult for me to really place contextualization on this, especially given that we're possibly dealing with thousands of years of reinterpretation and rewriting, and like we can't really come to certain conclusions purely based on this sort of historical context. Now, there's still a lot of merit to it. I mean, there's still a lot to be said about the role that child sacrifice plays. I mean, if we look later on at Jephthah in Judges too, and later on, of course, into the sort of examples that Kierkegaard uses as well, Iphigenia and Agamemnon in the Trojan Wars, that these things tend to be a trope in literature as well. Now, the question is, as well, are they endorsing this practice or are they attacking it? Here's another factor that we might wonder as well about this historical context. Just because it is within the historical context doesn't mean that it endorses the practice. It could be very well that this was very widely practiced, but actually whoever sort of edited in some way could have made it so that actually, no, it's actually going against the common practice that was happening at the time. So there are many different sort of routes to go with it, and I think it becomes a very complicated and very difficult to sort of find your head around this space. Maybe at some point you will, and maybe you can some sort of great biblical scholar can sort of find a whole line of historical, contextual, social changes and the different editions and different rewritings to come to their final conclusion about what happened really in these times when Genesis 22 was being written. But unfortunately, we need to have the time, or neither do you have the brain space to do that right now. So I think it'll be better for us to stick with stick against the sort of anachronistic objection until they can form a more coherent, more solid approach.
Yes, I agree with that perspective, and I do also think that what one views as anachronistic approach also has a lot of implications on one's theology, especially one's views on God, just because if one believes in a transcendent moral law, or at least a transcendent God which is unchanging, there definitely will be questions where you could almost take that situation out to make a one-to-one replication, morally speaking, in our modern day, and it's like, well, I don't know, let's say your friend's dad's called Jeff, and you could say Jeff's dad got called by God one day to sacrifice his son to go on this mountain, maybe, I don't know, Mount Everest to kill his son, so basically Jeff brings his son in and tries to stab his son to sacrifice his son as a burnt offering. I suppose if we do view a transcendent God in that similar circumstances, that situation could be applied transitively to the modern world as well and raise similar problems. However, let's move beyond this idea of anachronistic views of it, just because I think there is more things to be discussed, and we could perhaps move into the Kierkegaardian view. What would you say is a summary of Kierkegaard's view, I guess?
Okay, so here are a few things that we have to take into account. We have to take into account the notion of faith, the notion of the ethical sphere and the religious sphere, the notion of the teleological suspension of the ethical, and the notion of duties. So this should hopefully encompass a lot of what is in Fear and Trembling, which is where basically this is all spoken of. In particular, I will try and see about the problemata from the heart, and the sort of first problemas. Is there a teleological suspension of the ethical, and is there an absolute duty to God? Okay, so with the problemata of the problemata from the heart and the sort of exhortation to sort of support Abraham, Kierkegaard wants to argue that Abraham was justified in virtue of him being in the religious, but he was not justified in virtue of him being in the ethical. So what we might understand that is sort of what he says in Fear and Trembling is that he who loved himself became great in himself. He who loved others became great in others, and he who loved God, he is greater than all. So what happened is that because Abraham has such a close relationship to God, he has quite literally possibly walked with God during some of the covenant situations. We can sort of see that when God gives him this command, this a very absurd command, this command that will emotionally trouble him, distress him. The promise is broken. The covenant is in danger. His son is going to get killed. His laughter is going to end. That he still continues to do it, not as a matter of following the sort of ethical duty, but as a matter of religion, as a matter of faith. Now we have to be really careful when we talk about this, because this has led to some interpreters of Kierkegaard saying, "Oh, he supports like religious extremism, religious horrible, immoral acts on the basis of religion." I think Kierkegaard is talking about something far more interesting here than that. He's talking about the relationship, the individual relationship between God and man, what he calls the dialectic of faith. And it is in Abraham, the most venerable Abraham, that this is seen in this sort of in the paradigmatic way. So then we move on to something like the teleological suspension of the ethical. So what he means by this is basically you can sort of split our notions of what happens normally in child killing cases, what happens in Abraham's case, is that normally this is a breach of the ethical, because the ethical is still in force. Now the ethical is involved in it seems to me that Kierkegaard is actually, he does basically cite Hegel here. He cites Hegel's notion of Stilllichkeit, the idea of the ethical life where you have duties to your parents, duties to the state, and duties to others. And this sort of ethical life, which is developed through reason, a la Kant, and etc., etc., this ethical life commands you that fathers have a duty to their sons, at least at the very, not even the very minimum, like below the very minimum, not to kill them. And in normal cases of child killing, it is wrong because it seems to violate that duty that fathers have to their sons. And Kierkegaard accepts this, and he sees the sort of tragedy in other cases, like Agamemnon, Iphigenia, and Jephthah, and his daughter. Those cases are tragic because within the ethical sphere, they have to violate this ethical duty in order to create a better outcome for their people. Or, I mean, in one case, it is just trying to invade another place. But then, I guess in Jephthah's case, it was trying to defend his homeland. Regardless, they were both within the ethical sphere. They didn't trespass into the religious sphere as Abraham does. So when Abraham does it, it's a different thing. There is a suspension, this teleological, so it's for a greater purpose. It's suspended, so it's no longer there. And Abraham moves from the ethical sphere, the ethical duties between father and son, to become irrelevant in this new religious sphere. And this religious sphere, where he is in this full dialectical representation of with God, this what he calls relying upon the strength of the absurd. This is a crazy, absurd, silly command that no ethical person ought to follow. But because this is God, it is different. Because he doesn't know the full workings of God, and because it seems to Abraham that he has trusted him thus far, it makes sense that he should still rely upon faith. And it is in this regard that Abraham is considered as a paradigmatic knight of faith. So this is, I think, Kierkegaard's view, that Abraham is justified, not ethically, but religiously, because he has acted in faith and in an individual dialectical relationship with God. And because he has acted in this way, he has followed it to the core. He has felt the fear and trembling. He has felt the horror religiosis, as he calls it, of having to sacrifice the ethical duties that he has, of sacrificing the love that he has for his son, for God. That at the end, everything is in fact resolved, and God has provided.
I think that's a very interesting view, and I suppose the question of faith in Kierkegaard, and I read Kierkegaard quite a while back in Fear and Trembling. I do have a book of Fear and Trembling there on the ground, but I do think there's a part which says faith is that which brings, or is a paradox which brings the individual over the universal. Yes. In some sense. It brings one almost beyond that idea, and I would like perhaps push on that idea of faith as well. What part of faith is that which justifies? Is it in virtue of having faith in something, or is it almost a state of being in faith? What exactly is it of faith which justifies the action?
It is the state of being, I think, because if it is just an action, then you can open it up to this, to being something that can be abused by religious extremists. However, since it's a state of being, it's something which is more special and something which is more unique in its sort of nature. So if we consider this view of the individual over the universal is the ethical life. The ethical is the universal, as Kierkegaard states. And the universal surmises all the laws and ideas around what is right and what is wrong. Now, what happens there is that because Abraham enters into this, since he has been living in this way, I mean, he lived in a quite prosperous city in the Middle East and moved away to a foreign land. He participated in multiple wars where he had to save his cousin. He had to navigate the politics of Egypt and Canaan and all of these places. He has to go through a lot in order to get to the place where he is now. And at that point, Abraham does not give up because he is in that state of being, because he has walked with God, because he has been given this covenant, has faith in the covenant. He has faith in God. He has faith in God's promise. And when I say he has faith, it is not that faith is something that he sort of separate to him as a sort of act or something like that, but rather he has faith almost as a intrinsic property to how he acts now. So his actions are a reflection of his state of being. So it is not the sort of something external to him that he's accessing. Rather, he has fully internalized and his acts now reflect his state of being. Now, this is a very important part about what Kierkegaard likes to think about, because he often tries to emphasize the role of the individual in sort of religion in particular. And it is here that I guess the author, in particular the author of Fear and Trembling, Johannes de Silencio, who himself is a very confused individual. He's not really a learned exegete. He has lots of questions, but the way that he's trying to move and understand what is going on in the religious sphere is to try and outline it as a paradoxical state of being. And once we understand it as something like that, then it becomes a bit clearer to us. Ironically, the less clearer we make it, the more clearer the whole picture begins to sort of reveal itself as. So as we see the sort of paradoxes and the confusions arise, the emotional, religious, moral things arise, what we see sort of in this sort of tightrope between sort of death and sort of just despair about this whole situation. If we're able to continue walking along this tightrope and find out what's actually going on, and I think what's actually going on is a matter of faith. This matter of being in a state where you are in a dialectical relationship with God. If we're able to make that end, then we can see what's going on in Genesis 22.
I think that's a very interesting point you raised, though I suppose we're talking a lot about the individual and one's independent walk with God, and we're separating that, I suppose, conceptually between the act of the extremist, perhaps, and that of Abraham, that individual walk with God, which cannot be justified, or at least cannot be seen from the outside. I suppose the problem then arises is, well, how can we know whether someone else is in that state of being? It almost is he is justified by his knowledge of himself, and perhaps the most ridiculous reading of the point which Paul quotes from Genesis, he credited to him as righteousness. You could almost view it in this sense to Abraham credited to Abraham as righteousness. There's always this idea that it wasn't God, it wasn't anyone else, but just himself. Only him himself knows that he was righteous, that he was justified in that action. And I suppose the question then arises is that, well, assuming someone comes up in the church and says, well, I've just been called by by God to kill my son. Now, of course, the initial objection to that would be, well, surely God wouldn't call you to do that. And another objection which would become is, well, how do we know whether he's truly acting out of faith or whether he's just viewing it as an action? Perhaps we could move on to the first question, the first part of that question in a bit, because I think that will tie naturally into other readings of it. But how is it possible for anyone else, if it is possible for anyone else, to know whether that person is being in that state of faith or is just acting?
Here's the thing, right? I do not know. I do not think it is possible. So this is the final problema of Fear and Trembling. Was it ethically defensible to hide it from Sarah, Eleazar, and the slaves? Now, it seems to me that Kierkegaard reverts, or Johannes de Silencio in particular, reverts from the sort of faith back to the aesthetic and then brings it back to faith. So he uses sort of aesthetic examples of like so someone's in love with another person but they can't be in love, so they have to almost hide their love, they have to act in concealment, and once they do conceal it because they live in the aesthetic, it all falls apart. Now that seems to be like quite like interesting and a story to be considered in itself, but if anyone else were to see what was going on, they would not be able to understand. Now, let's also look at another feature of this. How does Kierkegaard describe the Knight of Faith in his own time? Someone who looks almost exactly like a normal person. But there's a key thing that's going on there. He has a lot of vigor, a lot of energy. He's able to talk from throughout the entire harbour of Copenhagen. And even if his wife has not cooked his dinner, he's still happy. He doesn't get fazed by all these sort of petty things because he has almost put everything, his whole trust in God. I think if one were, so in the particular case of Abraham, I don't think it would be possible for anyone else to see if this was actually going on, unless they themselves saw the angel of the Lord descend at the end. In a similar case, I don't know if anyone would be able to see what would happen if someone said, but I think there's a different thing that they don't need to see what's going on. It doesn't need to be, so like for example, there's a distinction between me saying, I ought to kill my son right now, given that I do have a son, obviously. I ought to kill my son right now, and because God told me to, right? And the reason why it's different for me is because I haven't been through all of that with God like Abraham has. I am not like the patriarchs, the great those great men who lived many years, who will live probably many years longer than who has lived many years longer than I have. And it is in that we may sort of not see but feel the sort of um justification there. And I don't know if I would continue to use this word justification because it has a sort of moral baggage and it makes it too propositional, because I think what's happening here is something which goes beyond words and goes beyond logic even. It goes into something which only one person can really feel, and that is you. And the problem is when you try and universalize it as I think this is sort of what the argument sort of you go, Josh, is that okay, if it happened for Abraham, why do we universalize it and see, oh, if it happened to him and him and him? Well, that's not the exact purpose of the exercise. In fact, the purpose of the exercise is actually to bring it down to the individual. And when you universalize it, then it becomes like impossible to reconcile. It becomes unethical, immoral, and we should throw it in the garbage. But if we keep it at the level of the individual, and this means that we don't need to copy Abraham. We don't actually need to do what he did. In fact, that's not in fact the moral of the story, really. The moral of the story is to have faith in God. And the moral of the story is not just to have faith in God in such a way that you're just acting in accordance to sort of these sort of surface level things, but to really be in a state of being where you are in an individual dialectical, so it's like go back and forth relationship with God.
I quite like that reading, and I quite like it because it goes into an even further meta-analysis of the situation. It's not even just saying, I want to be like Abraham and be justified like Abraham, but is I want to get into the state of being in relationship with God, which would justify the action in which I would act like Abraham if it happened to me. And I like that reading of it. Though I suppose there still is that question of, and I think now this is a good segue into the Kantian objection, which is it even realistic or is it even correct to say that God himself would command such a thing? Would it be right to say God has asked me to do something like that? Do you think that's do you think it's right to have that categorization? Do you think God would do it, or do you think it opens up to almost a somewhat teleological thinking or almost even a utilitarian view of God, to say that was just the one situation where it would lead to a good event, and as a result that ultimately retrospectively justifies the initial action?
And here's where I'm going to try and begin my... I don't know if this will be successful, but let's talk a little bit about why Kant thinks that, and why Kant is wrong, and how Kant being wrong can actually illuminate our sort of perspective here. Okay, so number one, why does Kant think that God is evil here? The reason is because when it comes to the moral law and God, the moral law is superior. This is his answer to the Euthyphro dilemma. His answer is that actually, what makes things pious is not because the gods command it, but because it is pious in itself. And God always follows the moral law as anyone does, because God is rational. God is reason. Here's where Kant is wrong. Once again, he falls into the common mistake when it comes to Euthyphro problem is he bifurcates between what is good and what is God. And we can almost have a more Thomistic answer here that because God is the good, there is sort of no problem here. The Euthyphro dilemma sort of becomes absurd, and we can just sort of throw it away because God is the good. Anything that is participating within the idea of good is God, right? God is the good. There is no sort of higher or lower or precedence or after what's going on here. God is the good. Now, because God is the good, there's another factor that might illuminate things here. How well are we able to understand that? I think it seems to me that a lot of people hear that and then they're just like, okay, Aquinas has solved it, right? Good job, guys. The battle's over. We can go home now. GG, right? But I think there's something more interesting happening there. Is that how are we to understand the statement? The cataphatic statement, God is good. Cataphatic means positive sense. Do we actually understand that statement at all, really? Like, what actual faculties do we have to do that? What abilities do we have? We have maybe some ideas. We can, in particular, the main idea we might look to is Jesus Christ, of course. I think that might be our primary or even sole way of understanding that statement. It is through his sacrifice that his goodness and his love is fully manifest. But that's a Christian understanding. How are we to understand that statement? How are we to understand that statement in terms of Abraham? I don't know. I don't know if we should.
Yes.
And if we don't know how we should do it, then how are we meant to sort of blame or even damn God in this situation? Would we then just end up like the Job's so-called friends, and begin to sort of defend God or attack God when he does not need either defending or attacking?
And I think that leads to a very dangerous view on God, I suppose, or at least a very dangerous question where you're saying, well, what can we actually positively know about God? And even if we know something positively about God, does it actually mean anything? And I suppose, and I don't think it's like, does it mean anything? Because you can almost make a positive statement, God is the good. But then, I suppose if it's truly as difficult to pin down what we mean by God is the good, it in some sense empties the value of what good means in its totality, and also empties almost what God means as well. And I think that's a very dangerous way to approach it. Though I think there is a point where you say, well, genuinely, we just cannot know. And I think there's value to that proposition. And However, I would like to, and I think we could talk about that for ages, perhaps in another video, but I'd like to just give you some musings of what I think about the situation. I completely agree with Kierkegaard on teleological suspension ethical, in the sense I agree with everything which occurs after the command and the justification of it. What I disagree with, or at least what I think is interesting reading into it, is to say that potentially the God which gave the command to Abraham was not the God of the Abraham, I can't say Abrahamic God because that just doesn't make sense, but the monotheistic God of classical theism that we're thinking about. And part of that is because when I was reading, I've recently been doing a lot of rabbit holes in my study of Genesis, and I've been going into the study of polytheism and henotheism and other views of theistic views of God in the Old Testament. And I think there's actually a very good case to make that the Old Testament isn't necessarily as monotheistic as people would like to believe. And now people in the comments might just call me a heretic immediately. But I think there is a possibility, and it's very difficult for me to say this without laughing, but there is a possibility that the Old Testament entertains the idea of multiple deities who all interact with humans in different levels and different areas, and that over time, but at the same time, despite the fact of multiple deities, these could be fallen angels or whatnot, there is one fundamental God behind it, and it comes into defining what do you mean by God and what do you not mean by God, because in the Old Testament, you see the angel of God is almost seen as having the exact status of God, and in some sense, you look at God and you're looking at the other deities in the lands nearby, you're like, well, how are we meant to put them together if you viewed angels of God as almost a minor deity or a minor God perhaps? How does that interact with the idea of God himself? And if we are open to the idea that there might be other angels of God or other deities, like maybe a fallen Lucifer or whatnot, then could it be the case that the being which told Abraham to go kill his son was actually one of those other deities, a demonic deity, and was not actually a good deity, but because Abraham himself thought that that was God, and truly thought that it was God, his actions were then justified by his faith. And then, of course, the teleological suspension of the ethical carries on logically from that. But what I'm questioning is, in that original state, could it have been the case that it actually wasn't God, and it was some other deity going like, surprise, I've duped you, kind of thing?
I disagree vehemently, but first, I would like to defend my dangerous idea. I didn't say there was no meaning, I just said we don't know.
Yes.
But there's many ways to gain meaning. But however, okay, here's my primary defense of, or primary offense, really.
Yes.
Oh, yes, that silly idea. Okay, so, number one, there are points where you are correct. It is not always certain, especially in this earlier part of the Old Testament, before the certainty when it comes down to Samuel and David, of effectively monotheism at the most and monolatrism at the least. Here it seems to be a bit more sporadic and unclear as to how far we are pushing monotheism. But the reason why I do think it is monotheism that wins in the end, and the reason why, if it wasn't the case that monotheism was being produced here, and if it really was, it seems to me it really was that bad, like they'd have different goals proposing different things to different characters, then the editors, by the time of King Josiah or whoever a sort of theory of that you like to think the Bible was created in, would have just thrown it out, and it wouldn't really make sense. And the reason why it doesn't make sense now, if we want to sort of move away from the textual history, which obviously has many debates in itself, and move into the sort of thing which happens in Genesis, here's the problem with your argument. Elohim is the one that tells him to kill his son. Right? Elohim came down and told him. Elohim is also the one who created the world in Genesis 1.
Yes.
Here's the silly conclusion that I don't think you follow, but there's also another group of people who believe that the God that created the world is not actually the God of the good world, but the God of the bad world. The Gnostics believe this.
Yes.
Now, if you're saying that the God of that commanded Abraham to kill his son is actually the bad God, who also has to share the same name as the God that created the world in Genesis 1, could you actually be sort of leading to a Gnostic conclusion by the conjunction of those two premises?
I think I'm not leading to a Gnostic conclusion, but I think my argument, which I want to make it very clear. I'm not necessarily holding this argument. I think it's an interesting one, which I do give credence to. But I would say I'm holding to almost an Islamic conception. And why I say Islamic is that and I mean Islamic in the sense of their view of the crucifixion of Christ. What they say in the crucifixion of Christ is that instead of actually being Jesus on the cross, it was a dupe of Jesus on the cross. What if it was Elohim, but it was only viewed as Elohim because Abraham retrospectively viewed it as Elohim? Because we need to remember that when Abraham, the patriarchs were writing, or not writing, but when they were being talked about, they were existing in a pre-Torah context. They were existing prior to when the Torah was written. And as a result, when we're looking back at the situation, we're trying to read back or recreate what the situation was in the beginning. We're not like looking at the situation, and it's not like an omniscient observer writing down all the situations that was being that has occurred in the past. But rather, it is more so of a situation where perhaps it was via oral tradition, and actually some people would say, I think it was Bock or one of the it was not Bock, it was Bock's New Testament, I forgot who it was, but one of the commentators, and that's kind of irrelevant, but one of the commentators on the Old Testament has said that the texts which talk about Abraham and the patriarchs actually come in a post-exilic context, almost even after 2 Kings and Samuel. And that people prior to that, there's almost no reference at all to the Abrahamic stories. I mean, there was a few minor allusions to them, but by and large, there aren't many allusions directly to them, which raises a very interesting question of how much can we view of that recreation of the story, that redevelopment of the story, and also how does that tie into whether that actually was the same God or not, or how much of that was the experience of Abraham and what he perceived, because it could very much have been he thought it was God, as my argument grants, but it could have been another thing that he just thought was God.
But I think it just takes away from the whole meaning of it, really. Because if it was not God who commanded it,
yes,
then it's just Abraham becomes a fool, really. And Abraham becomes an idiot for following this person. And sure, he might be a faithful idiot, and it might be alright in some cases to be a faithful, holy fool. But I think there's something. Number one, the text doesn't say anything about sort of false God, so immediately, just from a sort of exegetical, eisegetical sort of distinction, I think this skews more eisegetical than
I completely agree with that.
But regardless of that sort of interpretation problem, I think it just takes away from the whole meaning of the story from a lot of different perspectives. Because if it isn't God, then it sort of just undermines the whole issue of the covenant, right? Because it undermines the whole tragedy and the whole paradox of this person was the one that commanded you to hold to have faith in me, and I will give you this land, I will give you a son, you will have an heir, and this God is the one who's going to take it away. Even given your thing, you'll be, this God says, oh yes, I'm going to give you all this stuff, and then someone just goes away somewhere. I don't know. Maybe comes back at the end. Is that Yahweh? Maybe it's that sort of idea. Maybe, but he just goes away for a little bit, and then somebody else just tells him, "Oh no, never mind. It's me, Elohim, JK. I'm gonna tell you that you got to kill your son, and actually put everything that the previous God put in danger." I think that's just a bit more convoluted. Number one, number two, it just takes away the whole meaning and structure of the entire sort of Abrahamic story. And I think Abraham, and here's my final point about this, I think Abraham is intimate. He's shown throughout the entire sort of text as being as intimate with God as anyone has been in all of human history since Adam, right? Or maybe Noah. Adam or Noah. Since at least Noah, maybe. He would know, I think. If that was God or not, I think. If anybody that could have been asked, he would know. And the key thing here is his response, right? Abraham, here I am. Abraham, here I am. If he says, who are you? Or what do you want me to do? Or he asks a question. No, he doesn't ask any questions. He just says, here I am. What's up? What's going on? Just You didn't say what's up, what's going on, because those are questions. I mean, obviously those are questions just like kind of muted questions, but like it's a very sort of curt answer that can only be sort of provided if you're in such a relationship, such a strong relationship with a being, with anyone really. Like, if I were to like call you up, like, where are you? Here I am. Like, it's a very sort of curt, common sort of friendly answer that can only be understood if you're in an intimate relation. If you was being fooled, then it would have been a really good deception, and I'm not even sure if I would even go so far to accept that. Yeah.
I think that's a wonderful place to end off this video. Let me know your thoughts about everything that's been discussed. Do you believe in a multi-god hypothesis, a deceiving god, or not? Let me know in your comments below. Stay safe, my friends. See you soon. Thank you for watching. If you want to support our channel on our Patreon, then check it out in the link below as well. Stay safe, my friends. See you soon. Thank you for watching, and goodbye. I'll see you next one.